Hello and welcome to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at University Bookstore is author Ari Berman. Ari, thanks for coming by.
Good to see you, Nancy. Thank you.
So your book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America, I just thought was one of the most important books that I've read in a really long time.
Thank you.
Could you tell me, or could you talk about how you came up with this idea, why you felt this was the right time? Was it the Supreme Court's decision that sort of focused you on this subject?
Well, interestingly, I sold the book before the Supreme Court's decision in 2013 to undercut a key part of the Voting Rights Act, because I began covering this subject matter of voting rights in early 2011. And the reason why I started covering it then is because after the 2010 election, many states flipped from blue to red or became a whole lot redder. So there was these very large Republican majorities all across the country. And we began to see new efforts to try to restrict the right to vote. Things like shutting down voter registration drives, cutting early voting, requiring strict forms of ID to cast a ballot, purging the voting rolls, disenfranchising ex-felons. There was a wave of new efforts to restrict the right to vote, not just in places like Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, which we historically think of when we think of voting rights, but also in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio that did not have the same history when it came to voter disenfranchisement. So I covered these efforts all the way through the 2012 election. And then after that election, the Supreme Court decided to hear a challenge to the Voting Rights Act. And so when the Supreme Court decided to hear the challenge, I kind of could see the writing on the wall, knowing the composition of this Supreme Court. And I sold the book. And obviously, once the Supreme Court then gutted the Voting Rights Act, this story became a very important one to tell, because I knew that this year in 2015, we were going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. So people were going to be thinking about the Voting Rights Act, but I also knew that we were going to be in a whole new struggle over voting rights. And this would have a major impact on the next presidential election as well.
Why do you think the Voting Rights Act has never gotten as much press as the Civil Rights Act, which were passed so closely together?
Well, the Civil Rights Act came first,
yes,
and it came after President Kennedy's assassination and right after Lyndon Johnson became president. So there was a lot that was wrapped up in it, and it was an easy story to tell. And people kind of understood the Civil Rights Act, that it desegregated places all across the country. So it meant that you could stay in the hotel you wanted, or you could have what you wanted and eat where you wanted and do all of these things that people could feel on their daily lives. And the Voting Rights Act was maybe a little bit more of a complicated story, that this involved changes to election law, that this was a very complicated undertaking, and that because it came after the Civil Rights Act took a lot of the headlines. From my perspective, the Voting Rights Act did get a lot of attention, but clearly there are people that don't know a lot about it.
Right. So you weren't surprised by the Roberts Court's decision to, you said gut, I would say eviscerate, but the same idea. You weren't surprised by that?
I was not surprised by it. I wasn't surprised by it first because the Supreme Court had heard an earlier challenge to the Voting Rights Act in 2009. And they made it pretty clear that they weren't too crazy about the law, and that if another challenge came up, which they practically encouraged with that 2009 decision, that there would probably be a negative opinion with regards to the Voting Rights Act. And then the second thing is I was just aware of John Roberts' history with the Voting Rights Act, that he was someone who, from the time when he was a young lawyer in the Reagan Justice Department, was very critical of the Voting Rights Act. And while I didn't totally know which way Anthony Kennedy, who was the ostensible swing vote, would go, I knew that there was a pretty high likelihood that this case would come down in the way that it did.
So will you explain to the viewers what the Voting Rights Act entailed, and then what the Supreme Court did to take the clause out of the pincers out of the act?
So initially in 1965, the Voting Rights Act did a few very important things. The first was that it struck down literacy tests and related devices that had prevented African Americans from being able to register to vote, let alone even vote, in the segregated South. So in 1965, before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, only 2% of African Americans were registered to vote in Selma, Alabama. Only 6.7% were registered in Mississippi. And the Voting Rights Act got rid of those devices that prevented them from registering through legislation. And so those literacy tests were knocked out overnight. And then days after the law was passed, federal officials came to the South to register people to vote. And you had hundreds and then thousands of people registered for the first time in places like Selma within days and weeks, which was a really amazing undertaking that I detail in the book. Right. Then federal officials stayed in the South to make sure that elections were not stolen, that you would be able to conduct free elections once people had registered in places like Selma. And over a longer period of time, what the Voting Rights Act did, and this gets to the Supreme Court's decision, is that they said that those states with the longest history of voting discrimination had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. Because they knew once the law passed that Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, the southern states would think of new and ingenious ways to try to thwart the power of the Voting Rights Act. And requiring these states to approve their voting changes with the federal government would make it so that they had to follow the law, they had to comply. And the Supreme Court said that that requirement was no longer needed. They didn't get rid of the requirement that states had to approve their voting changes. They got rid of the formula under which these states were covered. So they basically turned this federal approval provision into a car with no engine. The car was still theoretically there, but you just couldn't drive it.
Yeah. John Lewis is if anybody is a main character in this book, I felt it was John Lewis, who is there right at the beginning of the book and there again throughout the book. How did your discussions with him progress? I mean, how was he feeling about this? You talk a little bit about that in the book, about the Supreme Court decision.
Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book was because I was there during the oral arguments in the Supreme Court's 2013 case, Shelby County versus Holder, and I was listening to justices like Antonin Scalia describe the Voting Rights Act as a, quote, perpetuation of racial entitlement. And then I was looking at John Lewis sitting near the front row of the Supreme Court and thinking how this person must have felt to have shed so much blood to get this law passed, and really to then see the Supreme Court describe the Voting Rights Act not as something that brought millions of new people into the political process, not as something that had finally democratized this country and made these ideals of liberty and equality that we all talk about real, but instead think of it as something that had turned into a racial entitlement. How must someone like John Lewis have felt? And then I interviewed John Lewis a day after that Supreme Court decision. And the Supreme Court oral arguments, and he was furious. And he felt like he was fighting all of these battles all over again. That everything that he thought he had won in 1965, the Supreme Court and states all across the country were targeting. And so I felt an obligation to tell this story because we were in a whole nother struggle. And I wanted to see, I wanted readers to know that these battles didn't end in 1965, that history didn't end in 1965, and the civil rights movement didn't stop in Selma, because so many accounts of the civil rights movement end
with the march.
With the march from Selma to Montgomery and the passage of the Voting Rights Act. But there's 50 years of history that have occurred since then, and we have to wrestle with what's happened then as well.
Going back to Johnson for a minute, to LBJ, a lot of people in his administration did not want him to take on this task of the Voting Rights Act, and he ignored them. Why?
I think there was mixed feelings within the Johnson administration about what to do. They had just passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that was a massive undertaking. It desegregated the entire South. And so the idea of then taking voting rights up right after that, there wasn't a whole lot of enthusiasm, particularly among the lawyers of the Justice Department who were stretched thin in the 1960s and weren't getting a whole lot of sleep, as it were. I think Johnson felt like the vote, he called it the meat in the coconut. I think he felt that the vote was the thing that was finally going to give people the ability to change their circumstances. That it was great to be able to sleep where you wanted, eat where you wanted, work where you wanted. But the vote was the key to changing the power dynamics. And as we know from Robert Caro's books about LBJ, LBJ cared about power. He cared about power above all else. And he knew that the vote was the most powerful instrument that people had to try to change their own circumstances in a democracy. And so he really believed that if you gave the vote to people in Selma, Alabama, or people in South Texas, that their lives would change for the better.
Can you imagine another subject that's going to be as interesting to you or relevant to write a book about as this one?
I'm sure that there will be something, but what I really learned, this is my second book, and what I really learned from this process is you can't force it.
Right.
That you have to realize what is something that you're both willing to spend a lot of time to dive in on, but also is important.
Right.
And
Right.
I had the privilege with this book of telling a story that I was really interested in terms of, as a journalist, looking back at the history, but also something that I felt was really important and relevant, what was going on. And so what was cool about this is that I could tell a history that would be hopefully relevant 5 to 10, 15 years down the line, but also something that would be relevant to the debates of today. So it wasn't just a dry textbook, it was something that was living and breathing.
Do you consider yourself as a journalist and as somebody who's, studied political science, an optimist or a pessimist?
I mean, I think most journalists are pessimists. It's funny because we're both. We get into this because we're optimists. We believe that our writing can make a difference. But the more we spend doing it, the more pessimistic that we become. A lot of people see that we're in a whole new struggle over voting rights, and they're deeply pessimistic about it. How in the year 2015 are we still fighting about the right to vote? And so a lot of people take away that this deeply distressing conclusion. Since I'm in it, I feel a little bit different about it. I feel optimistic about the sense that so many people are now focused again on the issue, that it is really unfortunate that states like Texas and North Carolina and so many states in the country are making it harder for people to vote. But it's also good that we're talking about the vote all over again in a way to bring new attention. And it's been interesting for me in my reporting to go to places like North Carolina where there is a resurgence of civil rights activism, and to go to the marches and the demonstrations and see so many people involved. I feel energized as a storyteller to see that going on and knowing that there's some dynamism to the story, that everyone's just not sitting around depressed and complaining, that people are actually doing something about it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that the book does end. It begins with the Supreme Court gutting of the Voting Rights Act and ends with a scene, many scenes in North Carolina of peaceful protest and sort of just getting down to the grassroots and trying to get people registered.
Yeah, and it was interesting to me because the narrative in the book goes from 1965 basically to the present day. And what was so interesting about North Carolina is all of the people there had studied civil rights history, that even the young people there, they knew the names of the people that were killed in the 1960s fighting for voting rights. They knew the stories, and they felt like they were carrying on that tradition. And there were people in North Carolina who spanned all the different decades. There were people that I talk about in the book, a woman by the name of Rosanelle Eaton, who had to pass a literacy test in 1939 to register, who had to recite the preamble to the Constitution at a time when almost no African Americans were registered in her county. So there were people like that who remembered the segregated South of the 30s and 40s. And then there were people that were very active in the movement in the 1960s. People like Bob Zellner, who was a field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who were in all these protests in the 1960s. Then there were people of a new generation that had studied this history and were trying to bring that history forward. And so it was cool to see that evolution play out in one state in one movement, really.
Yeah, I think you talk about one woman who said something like, she didn't do anything in the civil rights movement, but this one she was willing to be arrested for, and and go to jail for.
And that gets to the notion that the civil rights movement didn't end in 1965, which I was talking about earlier. And there were obviously a lot of people who were active in the 1960s that are still active in these fights today, but new people are being brought in by these efforts, and they want to be involved in organizing that is multiracial, that encompasses broad forms of social justice. What's happening in North Carolina is you don't just have the NAACP protesting. You have the NAACP protesting with women's groups and labor groups and environmental groups and immigrant groups, because everyone realizes that the vote is the key for them to achieve their policy priorities, right? And the reason why people are trying to restrict the right to vote is not just for some abstract reason. They're trying to do it so that they can pass a certain number of policies and to give the most powerful and the most affluent people even more say in the political process. And so I think a lot of people are being brought in over the issue of voting rights who may not have demonstrated in the 1960s and may not even have thought a lot about Selma, but have been inspired by what's happening today.
Right, and I can see a lot of African American kids, young people, whose parents fought parents were active in SNCC or active in the civil rights movement, who feel like this is their fight now. And that kind of energizes them as well.
Yeah, and the people that I talk about in North Carolina, many of the students were at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, which is where the sit-ins began.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
In 1960, and so they're very aware of the history of that place, and they view their activism as honoring the legacy of those people who fought for civil rights in the 1960s.
I was very interested. In the book, you don't give a breakdown of the vote was 79 to 17 or something like that with the Voting Rights Act, right? I think those are the
in 1965.
In 1965,
yeah, something like that.
I think that was what it was. But and I was very interested. I wished you had included a list of who had voted which way, because then I had to go back and Google it, and just to see the solid South voting against it, and the North, both Democrats and Republicans voting for it, was pretty amazing. And Republicans, Roman Hruska, I think that's how you pronounce his name, from Nebraska, I think, or one of the Dakotas, just a rock-ribbed Republican voting for it, and people who we have come to see as somewhat heroic, like Sam Ervin, voting against it.
Yeah. People, I don't think, realize that the Voting Rights Act was much more regional than partisan in terms of how it broke down.
Right.
And that many Republicans supported the Voting Rights Act from the North and the Midwest and the West, and many Southern Democrats opposed it. And the interesting thing about the Voting Rights Act is it was reauthorized 4 times by the Congress. And as it's reauthorized in the 60s and 70s and then in the 80s and going forward, you begin to see that more Southern Democrats are voting for it, that the politics of the South is changing. And so we're told this narrative, which is that the Voting Rights Act passed and the South becomes solidly conservative, and that is true now, for sure. But there's also a more nuanced story, which is the South became a lot more liberal as well, that you had Southern Democrats who got elected with black votes.
Because of the Voting
Rights Act. And you had presidents like Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton who were able to be elected, and Barack Obama, because of the Voting Rights Act. And so it's not just this monolithic thing. Elements of the Republican Party certainly became more conservative because of what happened in the 1960s. But elements of the Democratic Party became more liberal, and the politics of the South became a lot more contested. It was monolithically segregationist before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Afterwards, it was a lot more competitive.
I was surprised at first when I read the sections about the current protests in North Carolina, because I think of North Carolina as in some ways, wrongly now I see, more northern than southern.
Yeah.
But boy, was I wrong.
North Carolina always prided itself as being the most progressive state in the South, and they avoided a lot of the civil rights battles of the 1960s because they had more, even in the 1960s, they had more progressive white Democrats running the state. And they had the best election laws in the country. And that's why the Supreme Court's decision was so devastating, because it rolled back all of those reforms that people had fought so hard for. The state, after the Supreme Court's 2013 decision, they cut back early voting. They eliminated same-day voter registration. They eliminated the ability to vote anywhere in your county. They eliminated public financing of judicial elections. All of these things that had made North Carolina the most progressive state in the South were cut back on, and then suddenly North Carolina had the same election laws as Mississippi and Alabama, which is what so many North Carolinians have been fighting so hard to avoid.
Right, and you think about if those people protesting at the sit-in at Woolworths, if they had tried to do that in a more southern state, Mississippi and Alabama, I don't think they just would have gone to jail. I don't think they just would have been arrested. I think there would have been a bigger violence. I mean, I think what I'm saying is that North Carolina was a fertile place for that kind of protest to take place.
And what we see is that the first protests really did occur in places like Tennessee and North Carolina, which had more liberal white elements. And then as people like John Lewis came further down in the South, Alabama and Mississippi, they faced a lot more violence and a lot more resistance. But ultimately, you had to have the protests in places like Alabama for things to change. You had to go to the center of segregation. And I just kept thinking about, and I talked to John Lewis about this, what it must have been like to march on Bloody Sunday. And they didn't know that they were going to face this tremendous amount of brutality, but they knew something was coming when they started marching. And to just mentally and physically prepare yourself. John Lewis was 5'7" and 160 pounds. You know, he was not a big guy, and to know that he was going to face this unbelievable violence, I mean, the heroism is pretty remarkable.
And I didn't realize, I mean, maybe I knew it, but I certainly wasn't at the front of my consciousness, that there were actually 3 different attempts to march from Selma to Montgomery.
Yeah.
And that the first one was the bloody one.
Yeah.
And then the second one, Governor Wallace had put an injunction on and Martin Luther King called it off as they were partially on their way. And then the third one was the one that they were protected by federal agents.
Yeah, and I mean, it starts before that. The reason why there was a march on Bloody Sunday in the first place was that there was a young civil rights activist named Jimmy Lee Jackson
who was killed
in an adjoining county.
Yeah.
And the idea was to march from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital, with his coffin to protest the disenfranchisement of African Americans, because the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, John Lewis's group, had been trying to register black voters in Selma for 2 years. They hadn't registered nearly anybody. And then Martin Luther King's group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they came to Selma in early 1965, and for months they hadn't been able to register anybody either. So people were really, really frustrated. And the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson was a turning point. And they knew they had to do something more dramatic. And King was very concerned about the first march. And it's interesting because it was SNCC that didn't want to march. And John Lewis marched anyway as chairman of SNCC because he felt a connection with people in Selma. And it was SCLC that had called the march. But then King sent Andrew Young to Selma early that morning on March 7th to try to get the march canceled because he was so concerned. But then when Andrew Young showed up in Selma, there were already 600 to 800 people there, and they were ready to go. So there was a lot of chaos surrounding this event. And Bloody Sunday was really, really the tipping point because so many Americans saw the footage from Selma. ABC interrupted its premiere of Judgment at Nuremberg. So it's kind of ironic. I mean, they're showing this film about Nazi Germany, and all of a sudden you're seeing all these images from Selma, Alabama. And viewers were confused. They thought the images from Selma were images from Nazi Germany when they originally saw them.
Wow. I was trying to think of another topic that I would like you to write about.
I'm accepting any suggestions.
Yeah, right. No, I'd be more interested in what you're thinking about.
Well, basically, we're heading into a presidential election in 2016. That's the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. So, I mean, I'm thinking about the next iteration of this story as it relates to 2016, because, I mean, there's new voting restrictions in place in key swing states like Wisconsin and North Carolina. And we haven't even started 2016 yet because state legislatures come back into session in 2016. New restrictions can be passed closer to the election. I don't want to give anyone any new ideas, but it's certainly true that both on the state and at the local level, you could see a lot of potential mischief closer to the election, and that's going to be harder to block in the courts, and it's going to require a lot of vigilance among journalists like myself who cover this issue. So not even thinking about another book, I think I'm going to have my hands full just as a journalist for the next year.
Did this start as a series in your mind, or actually in a series of articles?
It did. It began with my coverage of the issue as a journalist, first for Rolling Stone and then for The Nation, and then I had done a profile of John Lewis, and so that kind of got me thinking more about that this could be a book. And I took 2 civil rights pilgrimages to Alabama with John Lewis and members of Congress. And the 2013 pilgrimage I took really was the spark to do the book, because we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the integration of the University of Alabama. We celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Birmingham church bombing. I think celebrate's the wrong word for a lot of the stuff, but we commemorated them. We went to Montgomery, where John Lewis was nearly killed as a freedom rider, and the chief of police there gave John Lewis his badge, which was really remarkable because no Southern law enforcement official had ever officially apologized to John Lewis before. So that was a really remarkable, unscripted moment. He did not know it was coming. And then we went to Selma, Alabama, and this was right after the Supreme Court's arguments in the Voting Rights Act case, and there was just this tremendous amount of tension on the trip. You had some members of Congress that wanted to talk a lot about all the progress that had been made since 1965, but you had many members of Congress, including John Lewis, that were thinking about all these new barriers that everyone was facing, that you weren't just commemorating these issues, that you were honoring them because they were relevant to an entirely new struggle. Right. And that's what led me to really think that I needed to tell this story and show the history since 1965 so people realize that the voting rights struggle didn't end in Selma.
Mm-hmm. When I finished this book, I read it right after I read a book about education called The Prize by Dale Rusikoff, who was a Washington Post reporter. And they both left me feeling like I needed to do something. You know, what could I do? Because there are such big issues, and in many ways they're all intertwined. I mean, they're problems endemic to the way the country is moving along.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a book that sort of verified my generally pessimistic view of the world. But at the same time, as I said, reading about those people at the end in North Carolina really organizing, and I mean, it's terrible that they have to do it again, but that's
it's inspiring
hopeful.
That they're doing it. And in terms of what people can do, because I get asked this question all the time, and I mean, obviously there are things that people can do nationally. There are groups working on the issue, like the ACLU and the NAACP and the Brennan Center for Justice. But I think local organizing is really important too, even in states that you don't think about as pertaining to voting rights. Take Washington, for example. The city of Yakima just elected,
I know, I was just going to say
elected the first Latino city council members because of litigation under the Voting Rights Act. So a lot of people think about the Voting Rights Act pertaining to the segregated South, but it pertains to the whole country. And that states like Washington also have these fights, and you could also do local organizing there. Washington also has its own version of the Voting Rights Act called the Washington Voting Rights Act that people are working on, that is currently in the state legislature. So that's another thing which will make it easier to strike down election systems that discriminate against African Americans, Hispanics, or other minority groups. And the demographics are changing here as well. And I think what states are doing in terms of voting rights, it has a crossover effect to other states. So Oregon became the first state to automatically register people to vote. So when you request a driver's license or an ID from the DMV in Oregon, you will be automatically registered, and then you could opt out, which is really cool because it's both going to lead to a lot of new people registering, but it's also a way of thinking about the vote as a right and not a privilege. And saying that we're better off in a democracy when more people participate. So Oregon did this, and now California passed it. And many, many more people will register in California than Oregon because there's so many unregistered voters in California. Then California does it, so now it could happen in Washington, it could happen in Illinois, it could happen in Pennsylvania. So even in the blue states where we think that these battles have settled, there is work to be done.
Oh, well, Ari, it's just been such a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so much, Nancy. Great to talk to you.
Thank you for the book.
Thank you.